The House is resumed. Kia ora tātou, no reira te whare, inga iwi, inga rio, inga hawe wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Honourable Members. Kei pai. Honourable Members, prior to the dinner break at 6 p.m, the Honourable Member Sue Moroney was speaking and has 8 minutes remaining to address the House. We are on the second reading of the Appropriation 2011-2012 Estimates Bill and the amendment proposed thereto. I invite the member to seek the call.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Sue Moroney.
Thank you very much. And as I was saying before the dinner break, Mr Speaker, this is a budget that absolutely shows that the government has no plan. And if there was a time ever in our history that we needed a budget with a plan, it is now. Because this is the third budget of this particular government in a time of worldwide global economic recession, and still, third budget in, we still have no plan for economic growth. We don't have a plan for economic growth, but we have a prediction for economic growth. How's that? We have a prediction based on shonky figures of that suddenly we're going to have next year 4% economic growth. But guess what? Last year's budget predicted that as well, and it never happened then. And it was predicted the year before that, and it never happened then. With this government, it's always going to be around the corner. It's always going to be next year. But how can it be when there is no plan for growth in the budget that has been delivered? And on the issue of education, because what I have noticed in this debate is that every single one of the members opposite have been fooled into getting up and gloating about the increased funding for education. But, Mr Speaker, what the ministers fail to tell them is that the increased funding for education does not even keep up with inflation, let alone keep up with role growth. And when that happens, Mr Speaker, in a budget, what that means is that schools will be under increasing funding pressure. And what that means, Mr Speaker, when schools are under increasing funding pressure, the quality of the education goes down, but also they look to families to make up the funding gap. And they look to families to do that by increasing the donations that they ask for families. So once again, under this government, like it has the habit of doing, it is passing costs from the government onto families. And families can ill afford those costs being transferred onto them now because they face increased cost of living all the time because of that government's decision to increase GST. They also face increased costs for early childhood education. Now let's talk about early childhood education, because that's been an issue and Lawyers Upstate has been one of the ones that has been most fooled into this. They have been tricked by their own colleagues into thinking that this is good news. Well, I'm afraid it's not, and I'll explain very carefully how it's not, in detail. Because since that government has been in government, we've had massive funding cuts to early childhood education. They started in 2009, where they cut, and go and check the budget figures, they cut $295 million from early childhood education, and they cut it from an area where there were increases planned and improvements for ratios, star-to-child ratios, improvements that government cut, $295 million, and that was their opening shot with early childhood education. But wait, there's more. It got worse the next year, because in 2010, in their second budget, they cut early childhood education by an additional $300 million. So add those two figures up together. First two budgets, they cut $585 million out of early childhood education. And then they come along in 2011 and say, hey, it's okay because we're going to put $550 million back in. But $550 million does not add up to the $585 million they've already taken out. But it's worse than that, because it takes them 4 years to bring the $550 million in. So what they destroyed in 2 years, it's going to take them 4 years to not even get back to what was in place before 2008. So that's exactly the situation that the government opposite is facing. And I invite any of those members opposite to go and visit an early childhood education centre, one of the 2,400 centres right throughout the country, who on the 1st of February this year got a massive funding cut. And for those ones that actually employ 100% qualified staff, they had their funding cut by $1.30 per child per hour on the 1st of February. Now, on the 1st of July this year, when this supposedly huge funding comes into early childhood education, how much is their funding going to go up by? Remember, it was cut by $1.30 per child per hour on the 1st of February? It's going to go up by 9 cents an hour. Now, I don't know what the literacy levels are like from the government, but surely they can work out that $1.30, losing $1.30 and then gaining 9 cents an hour does not make up for the funding shortfall. It by no means makes up for it. And so what they'll be finding is that the centres that have had to put up fees to compensate for that government's funding cuts in early childhood education won't be reducing the fees as a result of their budget. It will be actually, those fees will be continuing to increase at all of those early childhood education facilities. So again, what we see is we see funding cuts from that government, smoke and mirrors, that actually has a bad impact on families. Because they will continue to face those fee increases for early childhood education. So that's early childhood education. They took out $585 million, and then they think they're going to trick us by putting $550 million in, but taking 4 years to get there. But in my remaining few minutes, I want to talk about the compulsory sector, because that's just as sad. What they've done there is that they've increased funding to primary and secondary schools by 2.92%, and they think that's great. They want to trumpet that. But guess what? Inflation is running at 4.5%. So those schools are facing a funding cut before they even start. But it gets worse, Mr. Speaker, because not only does that funding increase not even make up for the inflation cost, but it certainly doesn't do anything for the role growth that both primary and secondary schools are facing. So they're going to have to educate more children with less money, because it's not going to stretch as far. And that's the real story about what's happening with education under this government. Professional development's been cut again by this government right across the education sector. And if anyone understands and believes how important education is to our future, they will know that that is a dumb decision. A dumb decision, because we need the best, most up-to-date teachers in front of our children. They deserve to have excellent teachers in front of them, weaving their magic with them every day that they are at school, because that's what's going to make a difference. But instead, their government's spending $37 million on their failed national standards. Their national standards that most of the schools don't want. Not only the schools, but the boards of trustees don't want those national standards either, because they are failing. And this government's throwing more and more money, in fact about $37 million in this budget, at trying to fix up a failed system. It's not working, no plan for the future, and certainly not good news for education.